Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching the talk. My name is Shaofeng Li, and I'm from Florida State University. I'm an associate professor at Florida State University. So greetings from Tallahassee, Florida. I hope everybody is doing well during this special time. Thank you to Professor Gu for inviting me to share my research and my knowledge on language aptitude. So today in this talk, I will synthesize the literature on the theories and research on language aptitude. I will also discuss the pedagogical implications of the research on language aptitude. Let's get started. So let's start with an operational definition of language aptitude. So what does language aptitude mean? Well, language aptitude refers to a set of cognitive abilities which are predictive of learning rate and ultimate attainment in the second language. So other things being equal, those with higher aptitude are more likely to be able to achieve native-like proficiency, and they learn foreign languages faster than those with lower language aptitude. What are the components of language aptitude or traditional language aptitude? Well, it consists of three components. I mean, traditional aptitude includes three components. The first is called phonetic coding, which refers to the ability to recognize and distinguish sounds or mimic sounds. So supposedly this kind of ability is important for learning the phonological aspects of a second language. Language analytic ability refers to the ability to learn second language grammar or to learn the morphosyntactic aspects of a second language. Rote memory refers to the ability to memorize the associations between words and their meanings. So supposedly this kind of ability is important for learning second language vocabulary. A recent development in aptitude research is the notion of implicit aptitude, which refers to the ability to learn a second language unconsciously. I'm going to separate them out. I mean, explicit or traditional aptitude and the recently developed aspect concept of implicit aptitude in order not to confuse you. So I'm going to talk about one thing at a time, focusing on explicit aptitude or traditional aptitude before I proceed to discuss the theories and research on implicit aptitude. All right. The characteristics of traditional aptitude are as follows. First, traditional aptitude cannot be easily changed, which means that it's not easily influenced by external factors. Having said that, research has demonstrated that aptitude is subject to language learning experience, which means that learners with more foreign language learning experience tend to have higher aptitude scores. Traditional aptitude increases with age. This means that older learners or adults have stronger aptitude or higher aptitude scores than younger learners or child language learners. Aptitude has been found to be uncorrelated with motivation. So whether or not someone has a high or low aptitude has nothing to do with whether that individual is motivated to learn a foreign language. Aptitude has been found to be negatively correlated with anxiety, suggesting that those with more anxiety tend to have lower scores on aptitude tests. Aptitude has been found to be distinct from working memory, although there has been a call to include working memory as a component of language aptitude. They are correlated, but they're not identical. They are not the same construct. Aptitude overlaps with intelligence, but they are distinct. They are not identical constructs. So they are significantly and strongly correlated, but they are dissociable. How do we measure language aptitude, or what tests can we use to measure language aptitude? Well, the most famous or influential test of language aptitude is called the Modern Language Aptitude Test. It has 5 subtests that measure the 3 components that we discussed earlier in the presentation, which are phonetic coding, language analytic ability, and rote memory. The test was validated with 5,000 foreign language learners in the US. It has demonstrated the highest predictive validity among all tests of language aptitude. The initial motive behind the development of the test was to select learners or elite learners who could master a foreign language within a short period of time for state-funded language programs. So the purpose was to select elite learners for state-funded language programs. Although the MLAT has very strong predictive validity, the company that owns the copyright of the MLAT has stopped selling the test to researchers in language aptitude, so it's no longer available to aptitude research, researchers, which is why part of the reason why the Llama test has become probably the most popular aptitude test in current or recent aptitude research. The Llama test is a free online test that is roughly modeled on the MLAT. It has 4 subtests measuring phonetic coding, language analytic ability, and rote memory. It is language neutral. That is, it can be used to test learners with any linguistic background. However, a recent study has shown that the Llama test battery has low internal reliability. Another recently developed test is called the HiLab. It's intended to distinguish high proficiency and low proficiency, or it was intended for learners with very high proficiency in the second language. The test consists of 13 measures of 7 cognitive abilities. The test emphasizes working memory, attention control, and implicit learning. Among the 13 measures, 3 were found to be significant predictors of reading and listening comprehension. And these 3 cognitive abilities, or 3 measures, significant measures, are rote memory, phonological short-term memory, and serial reaction time, which is a measure of implicit learning or implicit aptitude. All right. I would like to talk about a study that I recently carried out investigating the associations between learners' perceptions of their language aptitude and their actual language aptitude tested using the MLAT. I'd like to talk about the product because I think it's useful. I mean, the findings are useful. If we want to have an idea of our students' aptitude profiles or aptitude levels, but it's not always feasible to give students a test, either because we don't have access to a test or due to time constraint. So I thought it would be useful if we can use a questionnaire or ask students um, um, assess their own aptitude, and if their judgments about their own aptitude are accurate, and then instead of giving a test, we can just give them a questionnaire. So in this study, I give students the MLAT, and I also give them a questionnaire for them to respond to, eliciting their perceptions, asking their opinions, or asking them to rate their own aptitude, such as asking them to respond to questions like, oh, I have a strong language learning aptitude, or I have a strong talent for language learning. And this is what I have found so far. So as the results in the table show, there is a significant correlation between self-assessed overall aptitude and the learner's actual overall aptitude reflected on the MLAT. For phonetic coding, there was no significant correlation. So learners their assessments or their own judgments about their aptitude were not correlated with their actual scores on phonetic coding. As far as language analytic ability is concerned, there was a significant correlation, but the correlation was between their self-assessed analytic ability and overall language aptitude on the MLAT. And finally, in terms of rote memory, their self-assessments of their, or self-perceptions of their rote memory were correlated with their scores on the rote memory component of the MLAT. So overall, I would say learners' attitude, judgments, I would say attitude, their judgments, their assessments of their own aptitude are kind of accurate, but to a certain extent. So I think if you really want to have an estimate of your students' aptitude, if you don't want to give them a test, and you can just give them a questionnaire, keeping in mind that their perceptions of their aptitude are not perfectly accurate. Okay, next slide. I'd like to talk about second language theories on the role of language aptitude and traditional aptitude. Well, first, according to the Carolian approach, which is named after Carroll, John Carroll, who developed the MLAT. Language aptitude is a determinant of ultimate learning success. And behind this approach is behaviorism, which underlies the then popular audiolingual approach, teaching approach characterized by rote learning and mechanical practice. According to the ATI approach, or aptitude treatment interaction model proposed by Robinson, whether or not language aptitude is important depends on whether there is a fit between a learner's aptitude profile and the processing demands of the learning condition. So in this approach, the role of language aptitude is dynamic and contingent. So it depends on the processing demands of the kind of instruction used to teach learners. All right, the fundamental difference hypothesis relates to the relationships between aptitude and age effects. So according to this theory, children rely on their universal grammar or innate language acquisition device, which allows them to learn a second language quickly, unconsciously, and easily. Adults, however, have lost that kind of ability, and they have to rely on explicit learning abilities, which are called domain general analytic abilities by Believe-Roman. Well, the next theory is called the staged model, according to which language learning can be divided into several stages, which involve different cognitive abilities. So the first stage is called noticing, where learners draw on their phonetic coding ability and working memory to detect linguistic input. And then in the second stage, which is called patterning, they use their language analytic ability to learn rules, to extrapolate or formulate rules. In the third stage, which is called controlling, learners apply their proceduralizing ability to gain more control over their learned knowledge. And finally, in the final stage, which is called lexicalizing or automatization, learners use their memory abilities to automatize the knowledge that they have learned. This involves the retrieval of their learned knowledge from their linguistic repertoire. All right, next slide. So what has research demonstrated about the role of language aptitude in second language learning? Overall, the research has sought to answer three questions. The first question being whether aptitude is important for learning success, regardless of learning context or instruction type. The second question concerns whether aptitude has differential effects under different learning conditions, or whether language aptitude is differentially correlated with the effectiveness of different kinds of instructional treatments. The third question that aptitude research has sought to answer is whether aptitude is related to age effects, or more specifically, whether child language learners and adult learners draw on aptitude in different ways. All right. All right, so in terms of the overall association between aptitude and learning success, this relates to research that does not involve instructional treatments. The research has found that overall aptitude is a strong predictor of learning success or of L2 proficiency with an average correlation of 0.5. To have a sense of what 0.5 means, we can compare the result, the effect size, with the mean correlations found for other, individual difference variables and learning outcomes. So the average correlation for working memory and second language learning is 0.25. And the mean correlation between motivation and learning outcomes or second language learning attainment is 0.37. And for anxiety, the correlation is negative 0.36. And the mean correlation between intelligence and general academic learning is 0.5. So based on these results or these comparisons, we can conclude that aptitude has a strong correlation with learning success. right? The correlational research has also demonstrated that aptitude has a stronger correlation or mean correlation um, with the learning outcomes of high school learners compared with university learners, suggesting that language aptitude may be more important in initial stages of second language learning and less important at more advanced stages. In terms of the third research question, I'm sorry, the second research question, which concerns the relationship between aptitude and age. And recall that this stream of research is based on the fundamental difference hypothesis, which says that adults draw on aptitude or explicit aptitude, but children or child language learners do not draw on language aptitude. So two hypotheses can be derived or generated from this theory concerning aptitude and age. One is that language aptitude is only correlated with adult second language acquisition, but not with child language acquisition or child second language acquisition. For this hypothesis, the findings are mixed. So the hypothesis is confirmed by de Keyser 2000 and Granina and Long 2012, but a different finding was obtained by Abrahamson and Hiltenstam 2008. And the second hypothesis generated by this theory is that in order to achieve high proficiency, early learners do not have to utilize their language aptitude. They don't have to rely on their aptitude. However, for adult learners, if they want to achieve a high level of proficiency, they must have very high levels of aptitude. They must have exceptional aptitude in order to achieve high proficiency. And this hypothesis has been confirmed by two studies. All right, this is a figure from Abrahamson and Hiltenstam's study. And this figure shows the relationship between age of consent and learners' aptitude scores. So these were second language learners who came to Sweden at different ages. All of them passed for native speakers, so all of them were perceived as native speakers of Swedish, but some of them came before 12 years old, which is the cutoff point for the critical period, and others came after puberty, after 12 years old. So but all of them were perceived as native speakers. So as you can see, all the child language learners who came to the country before 12 years old, their aptitude scores were spread out. However, the adult learners who also achieved native-like proficiency, all of them had high aptitude. All of them had very high aptitude scores. So this again means that in order to achieve native-like proficiency, early starters don't have to rely on their aptitude, or child language learners don't have to rely on aptitude, but adult learners have to. Okay, for the question of whether aptitude has differential associations with the effects of different kinds of instructional treatment, these findings have been obtained. So there has been stream of research or several studies on the associations between aptitude and deductive versus inductive instruction. In deductive instruction, learners are typically presented with the rule, followed by practice activities where they apply the rule. In inductive instruction, learners are not presented with the rule, but they are given input materials from which they are required to discover a rule. The research has shown that high language aptitude learners or learners with high aptitude benefited more from inductive instruction, but low aptitude learners benefited more from deductive instruction. And traditional aptitude also interfaces with explicit and implicit instruction. It has been found to be more strongly correlated with the effects of explicit instruction than the effects of implicit instruction, which is why it's important to conceptualize, measure, and validate the construct of implicit aptitude, which is the next topic of my presentation. So from now on, I'm going to talk about implicit language aptitude, which is a cutting edge topic in aptitude research. First, let me define what implicit aptitude is. By implicit aptitude, we mean, or implicit aptitude refers to a set of cognitive abilities for unconscious computations of distributional and transitional probabilities. I'm going to talk more about these terms, distributional and transitional probabilities later on in the presentation. In both psychological and SLA research, implicit learning has been investigated as a process or outcome in terms of whether implicit learning indeed happens, and if it does happen, how it happens. But not as, implicit learning has not been investigated as a predictor of learning outcomes. That's why I called it a new topic. So it's a new direction, new topic or cutting edge topic in aptitude research. Recent initiatives on implicit aptitude I'm involved in include a special issue of studies in second language acquisition, and also a colloquium I proposed at next year's JBL. All right, in order to contextualize our discussion of implicit aptitude, I would like to make a distinction between explicit and implicit learning first. So according to dual process theories of human learning, human learning happens in two distinct ways: explicit learning and implicit learning. Explicit learning is characterized by conscious and effortful information processing. Implicit learning is characterized by unconscious computations of the input that's available in the environment. Explicit learning is is more recent in human evolution, because the initial state of human knowledge is primarily intuitive, implicit, before it becomes conscious and rational. So explicit learning is more recent in human evolution, whereas implicit learning is more primitive in human evolution. Explicit learning is rule-based. It's analytic. It happens quickly. It's flexible. So the learning outcomes can be easily transferred between different knowledge domains or different skills. However, the effects of explicit learning are short-lived or are not sustainable. Implicit learning is data-driven, intuitive, it's based on intuitions. It happens slowly. The effects are not flexible. So the learned outcomes are not easily transferable between different knowledge domains and different skills. However, the effects are more sustainable or longer lasting. So once you learn it, you will never forget it. All right, so what evidence is there for the separation between explicit and implicit learning? Well, there has been plenty of evidence. So the research has found that explicit learning abilities are uncorrelated or even negatively correlated with implicit learning. By explicit learning abilities, I mean the cognitive abilities which are important for conscious learning, such as working memory, reasoning, and the type of cognitive abilities tested using traditional intelligence tests. Another piece of evidence that shows the separation between explicit and implicit learning is that patients with cognitive impairments in explicit learning, such as those who suffer from amnesia or autism, they have intact implicit learning abilities. And those who have impairments in implicit learning have intact explicit learning abilities. All right, next, what is the role of implicit aptitude in SLA theories? According to usage-based approaches to SLA, the bulk of language learning or language acquisition is implicit, is unconscious. Language acquisition involves learners' unconscious tallying of the cues behind the relationships between linguistic elements. Language learning is a matter of sequence learning. So learning a language means learning sequences of songs, words, and word combinations or phrases. And sequence learning has been measured as a key component of implicit aptitude in the literature. All right, according to Nick Ellis, explicit learning is also necessary, but the role of explicit learning is restricted to certain aspects of vocabulary learning and to focusing learners' attention on non-salient linguistic structures. And even if or even when explicit learning happens, its role is to help learners establish the initial representations of constructions which will be processed unconsciously later on. And the role is prepare learners for implicit learning. According to interaction hypothesis, implicit learning also plays a key role. Implicit learning or language learning is optimal when input is detected in low levels of awareness, and then the detected input is processed unconsciously later on, which is, I mean, the idea is similar to the claim of the usage-based SLA or the usage-based approach to SLA. According to skill acquisition theory, explicit aptitude is important in early stages of learning, whereas implicit aptitude is more important or more likely to be drawn upon by learners in more advanced stages of learning. All right, I'd like to summarize the major theoretical claims regarding the role of implicit language aptitude. Well, first, we have to recognize that implicit aptitude makes an independent contribution to SLA, similar to explicit aptitude. Implicit aptitude may have larger effects on complex structures, whereas explicit aptitude may be more important for the learning of simple structures. Implicit aptitude is more important for advanced learning, while explicit important is more important for lower levels of learning or learning that happens at initial stages. Implicit aptitude is important for the learning of both adjacent structures, which involve linguistic elements which are next to each other, as well as non-adjacent structures that involve long distance dependencies. Implicit and explicit aptitude are associated with implicit and explicit instruction, respectively, which means that implicit aptitude is only involved in implicit instruction, but not in explicit instruction. The same is true of explicit aptitude, which should be involved in explicit instruction, but not implicit instruction. Implicit aptitude, other things being equal, implicit aptitude may be more likely to be involved in grammar learning, while explicit aptitude may be more important for vocabulary learning. Implicit and explicit aptitude may interfere with each other in the sense that activation of one kind of aptitude may suppress the activation of the other kind. Implicit and explicit aptitude may work together in the sense that implicit aptitude may contribute to implicit knowledge directly, whereas explicit aptitude may contribute to implicit learning or implicit aptitude indirectly by providing materials for implicit learning. Okay, so here I'd like to summarize the characteristics of implicit aptitude based on my reading of the literature. It's a controversial topic. Well, overall, the topic of implicit aptitude is new, and so we cannot make an unequivocal claim about the components of implicit aptitude. However, based on the research that I have read so far, I think the components of implicit aptitude include, well, I'm sorry. Here I'm talking about the componential nature of implicit aptitude. So it's implicit aptitude consists of several components. It's not a unitary construct. I'm going to talk about the components of implicit aptitude on the next slide. So similar to explicit aptitude, implicit aptitude is componential. It involves both domain general and domain specific cognitive abilities. Unlike the usage-based approach to SLA and the declarative and procedural model, memory model, which hold that language learning is nothing special, and cognitive abilities for language learning are also important for learning other academic skills. My argument is that implicit aptitude involves both domain general cognitive abilities because they are predictive of learning outcomes, as well as domain specific cognitive abilities, which are exclusively important for language learning. Implicit aptitude, similar to explicit aptitude, is developmental, which means that it increases with age. older learners have stronger implicit aptitude than younger learners. It increases to a certain point, a certain age, and then it starts to stabilize, and it does not decline as significantly as explicit aptitude. Implicit aptitude is subject to learning experience, and this has been, this is a research finding. It's not a theoretical conceptualization. This means that learners with more language learning experience have stronger implicit aptitude. Okay, so now let's talk about the components of implicit aptitude, which I mentioned when I discussed the presented the information on the previous slide. So what are the components of implicit aptitude? As I said, it's a controversial topic, or it is an open question, but based on my reading of the literature that has been, or the research that has been conducted so far, implicit aptitude includes at least two components. One is the sensitivity to distributional statistics, which refers to how many times an event occurs. It also includes the sensitivity to transitional probability, which is different from distributional statistics. Transitional probability refers to how likely one event can be predicted by another event. So it's a matter of mutual dependency and contingency. It relates to the consistency of the co-occurrence of multiple events. Implicit aptitude to me has to also involve or include selective attention, which refers to the ability to select input. It does not involve mental capacity or effortful conscious processing. So it does not require attention at the level of understanding or meta-linguistic awareness. It only involves low levels of awareness, or the amount of attentional resources required for implicit learning to happen is minimal, unlike explicit aptitude and explicit learning. So how can we measure implicit aptitude? In the literature, implicit aptitude has been primarily measured by using sequence learning tasks. Tasks that, sequence learning refers to the ability to learn how to learn the regularities governing how symbols are sequenced. Sequence learning has been operationalized as serial reaction time tasks. Serial reaction time is probably the most popular measure of implicit aptitude. It's also one of the most reliable, consistent predictors of implicit learning. Llama-D is another measure of sequence learning, which refers to the ability to learn sound sequences. Llama-D has been found to be an inconsistent measure of implicit aptitude. Artificial grammar is another potential measure of implicit aptitude. It's a paradigm or task of implicit learning where learners are required to memorize some letter strings created based on a finite grammar, according to which, based on the finite grammar, some letter strings are created, and learners are asked to memorize the letter strings, and then during the testing phase, they are asked to recognize old and new strings. I have conducted a study using artificial grammar as a measure of implicit aptitude. And I'm writing up the results. Hopefully I can get it published soon. Syntactic priming, which refers to the tendency to be influenced by previous encounters with the linguistic structure, is another potential measure of implicit aptitude. It's an implicit learning task. However, in the literature, it has not been used as a predictor, or syntactic priming has not been investigated as a predictor of learning outcomes. I've conducted my study involved. I used syntactic priming as a measure of implicit aptitude in my own study, and the paper is in press. It's coming out soon. Another category of measures of implicit aptitude are called process control, which require, these tasks require learners to reach or maintain a certain goal and to receive feedback on their responses with a view to helping them learn the regularities behind the input. All right, so serial reaction time, as I said, is one of the most popular tests of implicit aptitude. And because it's important, let's talk more about it. So in a typical serial reaction time task, learners respond to a symbol that appears at different locations on the computer screen. And the locations at which the symbol appears are based on two sequences. One is called a target sequence, which is more frequent than the other sequence, which is called the control sequence. So after repeatedly responding to symbols based on the two sequences, their reaction time is faster for the target sequence than the control sequence. So learners' performance on this test is calculated as the difference between their reaction times for the control sequence and the target sequence. So a faster reaction time to the target sequence means better learning abilities or stronger implicit learning abilities. All right, let me show another test of implicit aptitude, which is called Tower of London. It's one of the process control tasks that we mentioned. So in the Tower of London task, learners are asked to move some 3 balls around from an initial state of configuration to the goal state. They're asked to move the balls around by following some rules. For example, only 1 ball can be moved at a time, and a ball cannot be moved if there's another ball on top of it. And the first pack can accommodate 3 balls. The middle pack can only hold 2 balls, and the third pack on the right can have only 1 ball. So basically, this is a test of procedural memory. It's one of the most frequently used tests of procedural memory in the research based on the procedural and declarative memory model. So the idea is, after repeated practice, learners' reaction time will become faster. They'll do the scan faster and more accurately, and they will learn the rule behind the game after repeated practice. Okay. So implicit aptitude is a construct represented by aptitude scores, scores on tests of the construct, and tests of implicit aptitude have to be validated by collating evidence on for three kinds of validity. One is called divergent validity, which refers to whether implicit aptitude is different from or uncorrelated with measures of explicit aptitude. And the answer is yes. So there has been plenty of evidence showing that implicit aptitude is indeed separable from explicit aptitude or cognitive abilities in the explicit paradigm, such as working memory, reasoning, so on and so forth. Convergent validity refers to whether measures of implicit aptitude are correlated with each other, or whether they load onto the same factor. If we do a factor analysis on the measures of implicit aptitude, I'm going to talk more about it because it's an important topic. Then predictive validity refers to whether implicit aptitude is correlated with or predictive of learning outcomes. The research has been conducted in two settings, which are naturalistic settings and instructed settings. Naturalistic settings are settings in which learners are exposed to the second language where the language is spoken. Instructed settings refer to classroom learning settings. Classroom research has been conducted in, can be divided into correlational and experimental research as far as the research design is concerned. So let's talk more about the convergent validity of implicit aptitude. One striking finding about the construct of implicit aptitude is its poor convergent validity. Because the research has demonstrated that measures of or tests of implicit aptitude are uncorrelated, and sometimes they're negatively correlated. And there has been so much evidence for this idea, or there's a lot of research that shows this finding, which is that tests of implicit aptitude are uncorrelated. For example, my study found that SRT, or serial reaction time, is negatively correlated with syntactic priming, although both of them are hypothesized to measure implicit learning or implicit aptitude. Gottfried and Kim found that serial reaction time, statistical learning, Tower of London, all of them were hypothesized or posited to measure implicit aptitude. However, they were not correlated. Buffington et al. Has a similar finding, which is that measures of implicit aptitude, including weather production, Tower of London, and SRT, were uncorrelated. And the task of weather prediction even loaded together with declarative memory, which is a measure of explicit aptitude. So these findings lead scholars to conclude that implicit aptitude is multidimensional, which means that implicit aptitude may manifest itself in different ways, and implicit aptitude may contribute, or the different components of implicit aptitude may contribute to learning through different routes. Unlike explicit aptitude, whose components are normally significantly and strongly correlated. Okay, So because of the poor convergent validity, um, scholars in implicit aptitude have proposed a modular view of implicit aptitude. So when we investigate or measure implicit aptitude, in order to clarify um, what we're doing, right? It's better to take a bottom-up approach to formulate a mapping sentence. For example, implicit aptitude is the ability to learn the distributional or transitional relationships between adjacent or non-adjacent structures in verbal or non-verbal stimuli in the visual or auditory modality. So the researcher would have to make a choice between the two terms in each pair. I would argue that aside from clarifying what we are trying to do in terms of the predictor, which is implicit aptitude in this case, it's also necessary to specify the predicted outcome, the dependent variable. For example, is the outcome variable or criterion variable an aspect of L2 knowledge, such as grammar, vocabulary, or pronunciation, or is it an L2 skill, such as reading, listening, speaking, and writing? Okay, so in terms of predictive validity for implicit aptitude, which refers to whether implicit aptitude is important for learning outcomes or is correlated with learning outcomes, the following findings have been obtained. Research conducted in naturalistic settings shows that implicit aptitude is drawn upon by learners who lived in the host country for a longer period compared with learners who lived in the country only for a short period. Implicit aptitude is also more likely to be drawn upon by learners with homogeneous backgrounds, learners who were recruited from a language learning or language training institute. Grenada 23 found that implicit aptitude was only important for agreement structures that involve the agreement between different linguistic elements or sentence elements, such as subject-verb agreement, third-person singular could be another, structure in this category. Implicit aptitude is not important in the learning of structures that involve form-meaning mapping, such as subjunctive mood. Okay, the research conducted with classroom learners found that, first in terms of correlational research, which investigated the associations between implicit aptitude and ultimate learning success, regardless of learning condition. The findings are implicit aptitude was correlated with high proficiency in terms of listening and reading comprehension. This finding was obtained by Ling et al. 2013. And implicit aptitude was also important in the learning of implicit or procedural knowledge tested by using, oral production tasks. Experimental research examining the interaction or interface between aptitude and treatment effects showed that in terms of the learning or in the learning of natural language, implicit aptitude was implicated under implicit learning conditions, but not in explicit learning conditions. Studies based on artificial languages demonstrated that in highly controlled incidental learning conditions, implicit aptitude was important in more advanced stages of learning, but not in beginning stages of learning. Okay, what's the relation between implicit aptitude and fundamental different hypotheses, which we talked about when we discussed the findings for explicit aptitude? Let's bring up the topic again because I mean, the research findings based on implicit aptitude are closely related or have important implications for this theory. So again, to remind you of the core component, core tenet of the fundamental difference hypothesis theory. The core idea of the theory is that children draw on implicit aptitude, whereas adults draw on their explicit aptitude because they don't have implicit aptitude. However, this is not what research has found. The research has yielded counter evidence for this fundamental difference hypothesis. For example, the research shows that implicit aptitude is correlated with both child and adult second language acquisition. Explicit aptitude, on the other hand, is correlated with both child and adult second language acquisition. And the third finding is that adults have stronger implicit and explicit aptitude than children. So these findings are against the fundamental difference hypothesis. How can we account for the disparities between the empirical evidence and the related theory, which is the fundamental difference hypothesis? Lee and de Keyser came up with two explanations. One is that adults may have lost some aspects of their implicit aptitude, but not the entire implicit aptitude. So they may have lost certain aspects of their abilities for unconscious learning, such as the ability to learn non-salient structures. Our second explanation is that implicit aptitude measured by using the psychometric tasks such as SRT, procedural memory tasks such as Tower of London. They may measure domain general cognitive abilities, which may be different from domain specific implicit learning abilities, for which the measures have yet to be developed. Okay. Last but not least, let's talk about the pedagogical implications of the findings of aptitude research. Well, first of all, aptitude scores have been used to achieve various purposes, pedagogical purposes, such as selecting learners who can master a foreign language within a short period of time, to diagnose learning disabilities with a view to waiving foreign language requirements for learners who get very low aptitude scores on aptitude tests. Aptitude scores can be also used to place learners into different classes, making sure that their aptitude levels are equivalent or comparable. Aptitude scores can also be used to provide counseling or to students in terms of what strategies are appropriate based on their aptitude profiles. However, aptitude testing has been dominated by explicit aptitude. If we find that implicit aptitude makes an independent contribution to learning outcomes, as we said earlier during the presentation, then all aptitude tests must include a component of implicit aptitude. Tests without a measure of implicit aptitude are incomplete. And secondly, learners who are classified as not having the talent for language learning based on traditional aptitude tests may be strong in implicit aptitude, and they may have equal chances of success in learning a second language if they're taught in ways that unlock their potential. And finally, it's important to accommodate learners with different aptitude profiles, given that some learners have strong explicit aptitude and others have strong implicit aptitude. So it's advisable to mix up implicit and explicit instruction in order not to disadvantage learners with either strengths in either aptitude type. It's also a good idea to mix up inductive and deductive instruction because learners with high and low explicit aptitude benefited differently from these two kinds of instruction. All right, I guess that's all from my presentation. So do you have any questions? If you do, and ask me after the presentation, either by emailing or in whatever way that's available. All right, thank you very much. That's all for my presentation. I hope you benefit from the presentation.